My name is Lila. I'm 42 years old, though I rarely think of it as my age. It's a number, and it doesn't define me the way it might for others. Life has become a rhythm, a gentle hum I follow without question. I wake up, go to work, have my quiet evenings at home with a book or a warm cup of tea, and then the cycle repeats. Nothing extraordinary ever happens, and that's just how I like it. At least, that's how I thought it would always be. One afternoon, as I wandered into a small cafe I frequent on my lunch break, I noticed him. He sat by the window, engrossed in a book, but it wasn't just his deep concentration that drew my attention. It was the way he held himself, an ease about him that contrasted so sharply with my own rigid routines. He was younger, maybe in his late 20s. Dark hair, sharp features, and eyes that seemed to absorb the world around him. His presence was magnetic, like a force I couldn't explain. I watched him for a while, my heart doing something strange in my chest. It wasn't desire, at least I didn't think so. It was something else, something far more unsettling. A spark. Something I hadn't felt in years. I tried to ignore it, to focus on the hum of the cafe, the clink of coffee cups, the soft murmur of conversations. But no matter how hard I tried, my thoughts kept drifting back to him. The way his fingers brushed over the pages of his book, the way his lips parted slightly when he read. I didn't even realize I was staring until he looked up and caught my gaze. A quick, fleeting glance, just a moment. But it was enough to make my pulse quicken. I quickly turned away, my face burning. That feeling, the one I hadn't experienced in so long, was back. And it terrified me. The next 2 days were strange. I found myself returning to the cafe, but not for the coffee or the escape from my routine. I couldn't explain it, but I knew I had to see him again. It wasn't like I was stalking him. I told myself I wasn't, but the truth was, I was becoming increasingly fixated. The more I saw him, the more I couldn't look away. I found myself noticing little things. The way he would smile at the barista when she handed him his order, the small, polite nods he gave to the regulars who greeted him. His manners were impeccable, and his laughter, deep and genuine, had a warmth that made my chest tighten every time I heard it. But what truly made my heart skip was how our eyes would meet. The first time had been a fleeting moment, but after that, there was something deliberate about it. A pause. A connection. His gaze lingered longer than necessary, and each time, I felt something shift inside me. Was it just my imagination, or was he watching me too? I couldn't tell, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more than chance at play here. On the third day, I sat at my usual spot, pretending to focus on my coffee, but my mind kept drifting back to him. And then, out of nowhere, he walked past me on his way to the door. Our eyes locked, and this time, he didn't look away. He smiled, just a small curve of his lips, but it was enough to send a ripple through me. It wasn't just a polite smile. There was something in it, something that said he knew I was watching and perhaps, just perhaps, he didn't mind. My heart thudded in my chest. Was this really happening? Was he interested in me? Or was I just fooling myself? The questions swirled in my mind, but for the first time in days, I didn't feel foolish. Instead, I felt something else, something I couldn't name but I was starting to recognize. It was the pull of possibility. The kind of pull I hadn't felt in years. And it made me wonder, just for a moment, if maybe he was feeling it too. I spent the next few days in a fog, torn between curiosity and fear. It was ridiculous, I told myself. I was a grown woman, experienced and well aware of the rules of the world. Yet, something inside me was urging me to take a step beyond my comfortable routine. To do something bold. Something unexpected. I couldn't get him out of my mind. The way he smiled at me. The way his eyes lingered just a little longer than necessary. It felt as though the universe was giving me a sign, and I couldn't ignore it. But how could I make this move? How could I reach out to someone so young, someone who seemed so effortlessly confident, while I was here, clinging to my ordinary life? I couldn't deny the voice in my head, urging me to throw caution to the wind. But it wasn't easy. Finally, I made up my mind. What was the worst that could happen? I couldn't just keep dreaming about him from afar. I had to know if this was real, if there was something more here than just passing glances. It started with a simple question. As he walked past my table, I caught his eye and smiled, hoping it wasn't as awkward as I feared. To my relief, he smiled back, warmly, genuinely. My heart fluttered in my chest. This time, I gathered my courage and spoke. "Do you ever have time for coffee outside of here?" The words felt strange on my tongue, like a foreign language, but they were out now. I couldn't take them back. His brow raised slightly, and for a second, I worried I had made a mistake. But then he nodded.
"I'd like that," he said.
His voice was low, almost a whisper, as though he wasn't entirely sure what he was agreeing to, but was willing to find out. My pulse quickened, and my mind raced. I had done it. I had taken that first step. It wasn't much, just an invitation, but it was enough. Enough to open the door to something I hadn't imagined possible. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind was a storm of excitement, self-doubt, and anticipation. What was I doing? Why was I doing this? But deep down, I knew there was no turning back now. I had invited him into my world, and there was no way to predict where this journey would take us. The evening we planned to meet arrived with a mixture of exhilaration and dread. I spent hours preparing, trying to appear casual yet elegant, as though I had done this 1,000 times before. But I hadn't. Not in years. Not with someone like him. The truth was, I felt out of place in my own skin, like I was playing a role in a scene I hadn't rehearsed. My reflection in the mirror seemed foreign, yet familiar, as though a part of me was resurfacing from long ago, someone I hadn't seen in years. When he arrived, my heart nearly leapt out of my chest. He looked just as I remembered him, unfamiliar yet oddly comforting. His presence filled the room, not in a domineering way, but in a way that made everything feel different.
Alive. Real.
The air between us seemed to thicken with the unspoken, a charged energy that neither of us had dared to acknowledge until now. I greeted him with a nervous smile, and he returned it with an easy grin. We exchanged pleasantries, but the words felt insignificant compared to the chemistry that buzzed in the space between us. I was acutely aware of every small movement he made, how he leaned in when he spoke, how his hands rested on the table as he sipped his drink, how his gaze would occasionally drift to mine with a tenderness I hadn't expected. It wasn't long before the tension became unbearable. We danced around it, talking about trivial things, filling the silence with small laughter, yet the magnetic pull between us grew stronger by the second. And then, in one sudden motion, he reached across the table, his hand gently resting on mine. The touch was electric. My breath hitched, my skin tingled where his fingers brushed against mine. I looked up, meeting his gaze, and for the first time, there were no more words, no more questions. Just this moment, this connection that neither of us could deny any longer. Before I could gather my thoughts, he was standing beside me, pulling me to my feet with a surprising tenderness. His lips brushed my ear as he whispered, "Are you ready for this?" I nodded, heart pounding, unsure of whether I was ready or not. But I knew one thing with certainty: I couldn't walk away now. Whatever this was, it had already become something far more significant than I could have imagined. He led me to the couch, his hands guiding me gently, and I felt the world slip away. The noise in my head quieted. The doubts, the fears, the age gap, all of it melted into nothing. His lips met mine, soft at first, like he was waiting for permission. But there was no hesitation when I kissed him back, no holding back from either of us. The kiss deepened, slow and intentional, as though he was savoring the moment just as much as I was. My body responded to him in ways I hadn't felt in years, an awakening that was as much emotional as it was physical. Each touch, each whisper, felt like it was pulling me further into a world I didn't want to leave. A world where time didn't matter, where nothing mattered except the two of us, lost in this moment together. And in that kiss, I realized something. This wasn't just about desire. It was about connection. A connection I hadn't realized I was missing, a bond that transcended age, appearance, or circumstance. In that moment, nothing else existed. Just him. Just me. And the world that had been waiting for us to come together. The next morning, everything felt different. There was an unfamiliar weight to the air, a quiet but powerful shift inside me. It was as though I had crossed a line, and I couldn't go back.
But I didn't want to.
In the hours that followed, I replayed every moment from last night, his hands on my skin, his lips, the way our bodies moved together, as if we had always been meant to fit. I could still feel the echo of it in my body, a tender reminder of something beautiful, something that had unfolded without warning. But I also felt the sting of doubt creeping in. I had let myself fall into this, into him, into something that felt too good to be true. And I was afraid. Afraid of what people might say, afraid of how society would view me, an older woman, in love with someone so much younger. What did that mean? What was it supposed to look like? Could I keep living this new, thrilling reality without breaking down under the weight of judgment? As the days passed, I found myself reflecting on everything I had been taught about love, about aging, about what was appropriate. All my life, I had adhered to the rules. I had kept my emotions in check, buried my desires deep, and told myself that my best years were behind me. But with him, I felt something I hadn't in a long time, a rush of life, a rediscovery of who I was beyond the woman I had become. With him, I didn't feel like I was defined by my age or the expectations that had been placed on me. We didn't talk much about the future. Instead, we existed in the present, in these quiet moments where time slowed down and nothing else mattered. There were no promises, no expectations, just two souls finding solace in each other's presence. But even in that silence, I knew something important was unfolding. Something I couldn't quite name, but understood completely. Love, I realized, was not something that obeyed rules or timelines. It wasn't about what others thought. It was about what we shared, what we felt. And in this unexpected connection with him, I found a part of myself I had long forgotten. A part that was alive with possibility, with passion, with the courage to feel. I no longer feared my age. I didn't fear what the world might think. I had lived a lifetime of rules and routines, and now I was embracing something that couldn't be confined by either. This love, whatever it was a gift, a chance to rediscover myself, to experience life again in ways I never imagined possible. When I looked at him now, I didn't see a young man. I saw someone who had opened my heart in a way that had nothing to do with time or years. It was about the connection we shared, something timeless, something that belonged to us and no one else. I was no longer just Lila, the woman who had lived quietly and followed the rules. I was Lila, a woman who had learned to love again, no matter the age, no matter the expectations. And that, I realized, was the greatest gift of all. As time went on, I found myself more at peace with my choices than I ever expected. The initial uncertainty had given way to something deeper, something far more fulfilling than I could have imagined. I had taken a leap into the unknown, trusting that love could be found in places I never thought to look. And in return, it had gifted me a part of myself that I had lost along the way. It wasn't always easy. There were moments when doubts would creep in, when the weight of societal expectations would feel like an unspoken shadow hanging over us. People talk. They always do. But I had come to realize that it didn't matter. The world could judge, the world could whisper, but it couldn't take away the way I felt in his arms. The way he made me feel seen, not for my age or my past, but for who I was in that moment. The moments we shared together were filled with tenderness and passion, but also with understanding. We were building something, slowly, carefully. No rush, no pressure. Just two people who had found something in each other that was worth cherishing. And maybe, just maybe, that's all love really is, a connection between two souls, regardless of the years between them. I had stopped seeing myself through the lens of my age. I wasn't a woman defined by what had passed, but by what was unfolding in front of me. I had rediscovered a version of myself that was vibrant, alive, and capable of loving with a depth I hadn't known I could still feel. And the most surprising part was this. I had never felt more myself than I did now. In his presence, I found a new freedom. A freedom from the expectations I had carried for so long. A freedom to be who I truly was, to feel what I truly felt, without apologies or reservations. I had been afraid, yes. Afraid of how this would look, afraid of what others would think, afraid that this was a fleeting moment in time. But now, with every shared glance, every touch, every quiet moment between us, I realized that love wasn't about the opinions of others. It wasn't about adhering to a timeline or fitting into a mold. It was about connection. About letting yourself be vulnerable, letting your heart beat wildly in your chest, without fear of judgment. I wasn't just living anymore. I was alive in the truest sense. And that, more than anything, was worth embracing. With him, I had learned the most important lesson of all, that love, in all its forms, is a journey. And sometimes, the most unexpected paths lead to the most beautiful destinations.